Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Volume 12, Issue 5, Rome's Indispensable Auxiliaries, serving up front and on the flanks. Joining me are regulars Jasper, Lindsay, Powell, Marc McCaffery, Murray Dahm and Marc DeSantis. So Jasper, I have a question. Let's start with you. Let's start off by defining auxiliary units. Chris, one of our patrons, sort of asks what made an auxiliary kit, cost, length of service, whether are they sort of a levy. So let's define what we're calling auxiliary troops.
You can go very many ways, I think, for that. The easiest one is anybody who is in the service of the Roman Emperor who is not a legionary, a guardsman, or in the fleet. I guess that, not the urban cohorts, of course, not the vigiles. It's their own category of officially it's for non-citizen troops, but there are units of citizen auxiliaries. But if we talk about the army, I think the easiest thing is to say for any troops that serve the emperor outside of Italy and are not legionaries. It's turning it upside down, but but I think that's about it, because there's so many varieties in how you could define an auxiliary soldier.
Well, you can go very literal meaning of it and say, well, auxilium in Latin is help. So essentially, you're talking about the additional units that are actually helping the main body of troops. So.
Does this, for example, mean that, for example, the Socii or the Foederati, who were also up to point the Marius era, they're also non-Romans, but they would be considered auxilia, yeah?
I would say so. I mean, you could probably argue that the auxiliary system is really old. The thing is that there's lots of ancient armies that hire foreign troops, or that use foreign troops is maybe a better way to say it. But mostly what they do is they actually hire them, they pay them. Either they pay a king or they pay the troops themselves, so they're mercenaries, or it's a way to control occupied territories like the Assyrians did. They would occupy a territory and they would take the men from, or a certain group of men from an area, move them somewhere else in the Assyrian Empire, make them dependent on the Assyrian sort of the government to keep control of that occupied area, and sort of as a guarantee for the people at home. But the Romans don't seem to do that. Their original system, their alliances are bilateral treaties, almost always, in which they make a deal, like, we'll protect you, and you might even get some kind of rights out of it in return for service with the Roman army. And then you get the original ally, the wings, the units that serve on the flanks of the Roman legions. And by that definition, anybody, so the Socii, any ally is an auxiliary.
So with all the importance placed upon Roman legionaries, with their efficiency, flexibility, abilities, so why do we need auxiliaries? How important were they?
Well, I was going to say, for exactly the same statement you've just said, for example, for efficiency, flexibility, and all those things.
Because the legionary is flexible, but the legionary, the traditional, what we think of as the Roman legionary, is actually a specialist. He has, certainly in the imperial era, Bishop and Colston make this argument that the equipment, the pilum, and the deeply curved scutum, and the lorica segmentata probably as well, those three things make the legionary the legionary. he is very good at being heavy infantry. And those three things are almost never used, as far as we know, or in fact never used by auxiliaries. Auxiliaries do all the other stuff. They do the ranged stuff. They do most of the mounted work. They do the light infantry. They actually do everything that the legionaries do not do. The legionaries are there if you're going to meet, in the early empire, if you're going to meet Germanic tribes on the battlefield and come charging at you, that's where you want the legionaries. And even in that case, the auxiliaries can do a pretty good job.
The strength of the Italian troops was, Roman and Italian troops, was as heavy infantry. And I think that was probably, if you're a Roman thinking about this, where their strengths they should be best applied. That left that there are other roles on the battlefield, such as cavalry, and non-battlefield roles such as maybe scouting, raiding, things like that were other troops, non-Roman troops, were better suited. And I think that what they did was they made a wise decision to put Roman troops, citizen legionaries, in the legions as heavy infantry, and leave other roles to auxilia, which were better suited to them, such as cavalry. A lot of Gauls were recruited into cavalry, and I think Balearic slingers, archers, were also recruited from non-Roman peoples.
I was going to say it's also a social status issue in terms of the Roman legionaries are the citizens. Clearly, all the auxiliaries are falling into that minor category. They are always commanded by a Roman citizen. They are, it is emphasising it, to the existing allies and to the new recruits that this is where you fit in the scheme of things.
I was going to say, what about the situations like Mons Graupius, where the auxilia fight as heavy infantry? So there's kind of a crossing over between the two. There are other incidences where you get mounted legionaries, where we specifically are told that there are legionaries who are mounted. So I think there's a blurring of the lines, isn't there, in between function.
Well, and exactly to that point, Murray, for example, when I wrote the piece on Edista Viso, when you actually read Tacitus, he talks about lightly armed troops, which would be levis armatura, and allied cohorts, sociorum cohortes, which sort of implies that the two different sorts of units, but we don't quite know what the differences are, and one is maybe more professional, one is not so. Interesting also that Tacitus in the Annals 4.5 talks about the numbers. Any detailed account of them would be misleading, since they moved from place to place as circumstances required and had their numbers increased and sometimes diminished. So they're that part of the army roster that nobody really quite knows how many there are. They're here and they're there and they're moving around. For probably all the reasons we've said, they've got specialties that are useful to move and deploy, and then when that emergency is over, they get put somewhere else.
And also, we tend to think very much in as if it's a fully formed system, which does seem to come into being throughout the Principate, but certainly the period that Tacitus is describing, and that particular famous quote that we can't avoid, that's about AD 23, that Lindsay just quoted. That's the period when this is all still very much it's developing, and the Romans have a strong tendency still, even when Rome has become an empire, they make deals with the client, with what they call client kings. It's just especially in the East, there's a lot of little kingdoms, and they just have a deal with that king. We'll protect you from the big bad world out there. You're part of the Roman Empire, but you're not really. And in return, you give us some troops that fight usually in their own traditional way. Not always. Sometimes they adapt to how Rome fights. And we'll move them elsewhere in the empire as we see fit. And they do the same thing with tribal chieftains in Western Europe. And I think those units are extremely flexible. And I was writing the introduction for this issue, and I was thinking, I wonder if the experiences they've had with, especially some of those tribal leaders, such as Arminius, well known, and Tacferinus, that the Roman emperor probably Claudius at some point sort of thinks, we can make all these deals with the people at the top, but we're buying their loyalty, but not the loyalty of the people under them, the tribal warriors or, the soldiers of the client king. They're still loyal to their own people.
But at the same time, in terms of Roman administration of provinces, if you look at it here in Britannia, they don't, install their own system of government here. They are using the pre-existing tribal, associations, and in that sense, it works to appeal to the
They keep doing that
higher
for a
up.
long time. That was my thought. Is that maybe part of the reason why under Claudius there's a shift. Under Claudius, many of the client kingdoms start to disappear. They just become incorporated into the Roman Empire, and you get the introduction of the diploma, which is a testimonial of a personal deal, not of the emperor with a client king or with a tribal chieftain, but of the emperor making essentially a deal directly with the auxiliary soldier, saying, "You serve me, and I'll grant you certain rights after 25 years."
And to that point, let me throw this into the mix. I see this assimilation as part of the process of pacification. So, for example, if you look under the 45 years of Augustus, for example, with the annexation of Noricum, Rhaetia, Vindelicia, all these sorts of places, they very quickly have, as part of their treaty, men are absorbed in, and very often they're immediately relocated somewhere else so that they are respected for their talents as warriors, but they're taken out of the risk assessment from the point of view that they may represent a threat, because they hadn't always done that. And what's very interesting is that the Bettonian revolts of 6 to 9 AD, for example, there's a case in point where, having not rotated out those Illyrians, the Dalmatians and the Beroicans, for example, when they see in strength how many people they represent, say, why are we following this guy, in this case Augustus, and not actually fighting for ourselves? And therefore they rise up in rebellion. So I see them as part of this very, very interesting way to pacify a people and buy their loyalty.
Yeah, but there is a difference. That's what I was trying to say, between how Augustus does it and 40 years later how Claudius handles things. Augustus is very hesitant to give foreign people and ex-soldiers citizenship. So he makes all these deals, and then that causes trouble. And then that's what I'm saying. My suggestion could be: did Claudius say, "Hey, if I go directly to the soldier, I'll bind them to me, and there's no level in between anymore"?
And in that regard, what he's doing is he does exactly what he's doing with the Roman citizen body called the legions, where they also, through the sacramentum, swear their loyalty to him. So he's unifying the soldiery in total by doing that.
Well, of course, an important thing to keep in mind with the whole auxiliary system is that it's a. I mean, Murray was saying there's a merging and blurring of the roles on the battlefield. There's a blurring of about all of that over 2 centuries, and by 212, when Caracalla says everybody in the Roman Empire is now a citizen, we don't really know how it changes, or at least we need to do some more articles on that, I think, in the 3rd century. But by the end of the 3rd century, there's no more auxiliary units, and there's no more. It's just all become one. It's one big pool of manpower.
Yeah. What happened was it was sheer disaster, because within 150 years the Western Empire's lost, so it was a miserable disaster.
150 years seems to be a lot longer than any empire lasts these days. So I think, but coming back to the point you made earlier about that there are citizen auxiliary units earlier. Why would a group of citizen soldiers choose to be auxiliaries, however different that made them be in comparison to legionaries?
I think this is what happens, and I'm looking through a list that I put together, for example, where you have these Curium Romanorum units. But for example, there's one here which is the 1st Gallica CRE, and these are cohortes. I suspect what happens is they do something, and they're all made Roman citizens in some sort of honorific way, and therefore the entire unit, the entire cohort, is made up of post
There's
act.
maybe I think there's two things that happen. There are units that are very early on specifically mentioned as consisting of Roman citizens, and they were probably raised from. I think the Pannonian revolts caused that for one. They lost all the Illyrians, or at least part of the Illyrians, because they came up in revolt, and they needed special troops to do that, not more legionaries. And then there are later on you get a lot of units that at some point get the epithet that Lindsay just mentioned. They become, the so manyth unit of whatever, this Gallic tribe or the Batavians, and they become Civium Romanorum. They've been awarded sort of a block grant for, as a reward.
So, for example, in the case of the Ritorum, right, for example, I've got 1 through 8 cohorts, and it looks like only 2 of them have CR after their regimental name, which suggests to me that they probably fought particularly valiantly, and they were given this honor by the commander. The other ones, not so much.
So there is partially in that anyway. There's a kind of a regimental pride of maintaining. They don't immediately go, right, we're citizens, now we're legionaries. They remain a citizen auxiliary unit. Presumably anyone who is enrolled into that auxiliary unit is a citizen from that point on?
No, I don't think so. It would, unless there are, the only way that you could find out about this would be if you found a diploma that was awarded to a soldier from that unit after the unit had so saying, hey, you're in this unit and now you're getting citizenship after service.
Or they enroll citizens to be in their prestigious unit, yeah. Like the children of the previous veterans, enrolling in that unit because that's the family tradition or whatever.
I wouldn't exclude the possibility that those exist, because the diplomas are also given out to, as you know, to the soldiers of certainly of the Italian fleets and the Praetorian Guard, and they keep doing that even into the middle 3rd century, when presumably everybody is a citizen already, but it's they're given these. Or they're having these copies made of an imperial degree to prove
that
their
stage,
status.
Are they for citizenship, or are they for tax exemption?
They're probably, yeah. There's something like I want to show that I've had a honesta missio. I've been honorably discharged, and indeed possibly tax exemption. There's other advantages, but because those other advantages exist, they might still be given to citizens.
So with the auxiliaries, was it simply a matter of cost cutting? Are they paid much less? Is it a propaganda thing where the Romans can fight wars and not lose citizens?
Those certainly help. I think that hiring auxiliaries, as we've touched on before, citizen legionaries were specialists, heavy infantry. They were excellent at fighting set-piece battles, but there were a lot of other roles that auxiliaries would have been better at. For example, there was cavalry, raiding, scouting, what have you, archery. What hiring the auxilia also does for the Romans is there are several things. One is that you are increasing the number of your own troops. A good thing, you become stronger, and they are less costly perhaps than a citizen legionary, and perhaps there are just not as many citizen legionaries available, and augmenting your numbers by hiring auxiliaries made sense. Second, by hiring auxiliaries, becoming known as an employer, the warlike young men in frontier towns, the ones who might ordinarily cause you trouble if left to their own devices, they have a place to go to become soldiers, and they are not fighting against Rome, they're fighting for Rome. And I think that those two aspects, that is, you are adding to your strength but also removing potential dangers by leaving them unemployed in the provinces is something that ought to be considered.
Well, there's another aspect, I think, too, is that if you go, my period is Augustus, but I think it holds up for the point I'm making, is that he had made a determination to downsize the Roman army after the Civil War in 30 BC to about 28 legions, from what we can work out, and eventually, with the annihilation of 3 in Teutoburg, it was down to 25. So 25 is really the sort of number he works. It maybe goes up to 30 under Trajan, so we're kind of really looking at about 30. But they're about 5,500, 6,000 men. They're very expensive. They tend to be less mobile, and they're in specific places after really Augustus has assessed that the borders are where they are. The wonderful thing about having the auxiliary units is that they are 500, 1,000 men, or approximately, and you can put them anywhere. They require much smaller installations. They are, to the extent, a sort of field mobile army, if you will. You can deploy them in ways. You can also assign them as vexellationes with legion detachments, so that you can form multi-combination forces, different styles of fighting. So I think what they bring into the mix for the Roman military planner is this degree of flexibility, which the legion, for its specialty, which is positive, is not going to help you win a war if the enemy is asymmetric in its style of fighting.
I think you also have to. I think the optics are very important. As Lindsay said, there is a limited number of legions, and every time a new legion is founded, it's kind of a big deal. It's the legion has an actual date of official raising, and they get an eagle. And there's a whole rigmarole, and it's a high prestige unit, and you can't put them in every province, because a legion in a province means that the province has to be a senatorial province, and the division of power that Augustus initiated between the Senate and the armed provinces on the borders makes it complicated. This is the reason why there are probably no legionaries present at the crucifixion of Christ, because Jerusalem is not in a senatorial province, so therefore there's no legion based there. And the exception is actually also Egypt, because Egypt is.
Well, there's 1,500 troops in Judea, aren't there?
There are always exceptions, but I'm just it has all kinds of implications. Biggest implication is, of course, that if an auxiliary unit, or maybe even 10 auxiliary units, get slaughtered in some on some horrible expedition that went wrong, well, that's bad, but there's no officially no Roman citizens who died. There's no legions that have lost their eagle and have to be avenged, and the eagle doesn't have to. You don't have to mount up a huge expedition to recapture the eagle. So I think it's as well as you all said, it's the political expediency of having all these units that you can pretty much do with whatever you want. And we know that there's a quote. Come back to the quote that in Tacitus Annals 4.5 that Lindsay alluded to, where Tacitus says they are about in just slightly less perhaps than the number of legionaries. He says something like that. So if we have 25 legions, let's say 5 to 6,000 men apiece. So there's about 125 to 150,000 legionaries. So there are about 125 to 150,000 auxiliaries. A century later, the number of auxiliaries, as far as we can trace them by inscriptions and diplomas and stuff, actually is about double. And there's not nearly as many legionaries by then, so the proportions have changed completely. Which again points to this suggestion. Having all these auxiliaries is just handy.
I'm wondering, coming back to the crucifixion and the fact that there wouldn't have been legionaries present in Judea at the time, but there is a 1,500 strong body of troops at Caesarea. The fact is that the provinces who have auxiliary troops in them still consider those auxiliary troops Roman. And so the sort of the stamp of Romanitas on their province is not, oh, we've got some Batavians, or oh, we've got some people from this place. It's absolutely a symbol of empire that is stamped upon them by their Romanness, by being Roman service troops.
Yeah. Well, there's going to be Roman officers, of course, and it's certainly possible that there are detachments in equestrian provinces.
Yeah, what you do is you put the you put the legionary bases at sort of positions where they overlook, for example, an estuary or an access to a river point, and you put the auxiliary units in other places, sort of either between or deeper inland or in areas where you think you need them. And it's fascinating, when you look at places like Africa and the Near East, where there's some pretty goddamn awful climates, and the poor auxiliaries are out there. You could argue that Hadrian's Wall is the other example, where that's built by legionaries, but manned by.
From Italian perspective, I think that when it comes to goddamn awful climate, Hadrian's Wall might count actually.
Well, yeah, but my point is that's built by the craftsmanship of a legionary, right, under the centurion and all the rest of it. But in fact, the people who actually keep it going and managing it would appear to be are all auxiliaries. And the nearest legion is York.
So Joshua on Patreon wonders, were there any battles that were heavily influenced by auxiliary units?
Yes. We've actually already mentioned the two most famous examples, probably Indispensable, which is in this issue, and Mons Graupius, which is the other famous one, after which Tacitus can write, "Oh, and we won this big victory and no Roman blood was spilt."
I think there are also other battles where auxiliary troops are important, or even the fact that the legions copy auxiliary tactics into the 2nd century and things like that. That there are sort of signs of Roman legionary tactics echoing auxiliary lessons that they've learned. So I think that's another part of the flexibility of the Roman legion. Even though they're acting as heavy infantry, they're absorbing the lessons that the other arms of the Roman army have learned and shown to be effective.
And presumably that's because you've actually got a Roman officer corps, the prefects and other presumably senior officers, who are moving from place to place, and they see things work there, so we're going to introduce that doctrine over here, maybe.
I was going to say they also come into their own in terms of the Roman civil wars themselves. I mean, you have Caesar bringing back Gallic cavalry into the civil war, and that being of worthy note to put into the commentaries. So you've got this otherworldly element coming into what would otherwise be a fairly matched situation.
Do we have a problem with the sources with auxiliaries? Are they potentially underrepresented?
Probably. No, but the Roman writers, generally speaking, want the big headline. You make mention of a battle like Mons Graupius, say, no Romans were hurt, but maybe 10,000 auxiliaries were, but we never know. And even, for example, some of the battles of the Caesarean Civil War, the one I wrote about, and I've forgotten the name, shame on me, Pharsalus. The vast deployments of allies. But again, when the tallies of the casualties are counted up, nobody knows about the auxiliaries and the allies. It's all legionaries. Those are the ones that only register on the Roman counter, which we look on with a certain unease, but clearly is part of their psychology. I think the other thing is also that Roman history is also about the great deeds of Romans. You don't particularly want to talk up the deeds of other folk, which is why when you do talk about people like Tacfarinas or Arminius, it's kind of the high drama point in the story, because these people are actually quite clever. They know what they're doing. They can actually outwit us. Because I'm sure the average Roman certainly knew that, but the average Roman in Civvy Street probably didn't.
Arminius is a good example because he's probably, we know all about him in terms of the defeat and the wars that follow, But in terms of, he had some history of actually having some training in the Roman forces. He may have been in campaigns with the Roman army, but we don't have those details. It's only when he's the other highlighted that we actually find out about him and find out about the links of what he's done in terms of being an ally.
At the risk of being controversial, I mean, the parallel is, in a sense, for example, there was that movie that was recently done, the colorization by Jackson of First World War footage. Yeah, and I've yet to see it. It's been played somewhere at the Alamo Draft House, and everybody really, really praised it. And then people, for example, of Indian and black background said, why are our faces not represented in the film? And Jackson actually made an editorial decision to focus on particular units. So you could argue, even in modern history, we underrepresent the diversity of contributing, in this case, Commonwealth forces. In the film Dunkirk, for example, I mean, there's not an Indian or a black guy to be seen. But they were there.
There are some Senegalese in one of the shots, I think, but that was a controversy in itself, that they weren't represented the way that they should have been.
Yeah. So I don't see it unique to Romans. I mean, to the victors, that go the spoils.
Look at the Battle of Waterloo. It's still represented 200 years later as a British victory when they were less than half of the Allied
British.
only
in Holland, it's a Dutch victory.
Yeah, exactly.
But of course, particularly, but the Germans have some. Anyway.
But not to mention, again, it goes even further because Wellington is the quintessential English general, but he was Irish. But I think the other thing, of course, is that very often in our sources, coming back to your point, Lindsay, we get legionaries mentioned, and we have to assume. Jasper was saying, we have to assume the number of auxiliaries that would have been present. We're told a legion, and we then assume, and an equal number of auxiliaries. It's kind of a parenthesis, silent addition to whatever our source says. But again, that's not just about Roman sources. We have that all the time in Greek sources. They talk about hoplites. Hoplites are the high status citizen warriors of the city-states who do the important stuff. Every now and then you'll get the mention of light armed troops. Thucydides is much better at mentioning actual numbers of light armed troops than any other Greek source. And then, again, we go, so there's 10,000 hoplites, but there's probably an equal number of light armed troops, psiloi and pelts and other things present that we don't get mentioned because the emphasis is on what hoplites did to hoplites.
To give the question sort of concrete basis here, in one of the boxes that I wrote for the Diviso battle, I mentioned the fact that the source that we have for the battle itself, and in fact Angevarian Wall and the one that preceded it, Vezero, all come from Tacitus. But it's very clear that he is relying most likely on Pliny the Elder's, I think it's like a 12-volume set or so, which purports to cover all the German wars that Romans ever fought in up to the early 1st century, and that's all entirely lost. So I would imagine with Pliny the Elder's sort of usual comprehensive vacuum cleaner approach to documenting everything, you would have had all this wonderful minutiae in it ad nauseam probably, but it didn't form great narrative for Tacitus. So, for example, you actually have the marching onto the battlefield of 8 legions and all in the marching order. It's very dramatic, and there's artillerymen and all sorts of things going on, and then they vanish from the story. All you get is this attempt on the archers and a sort of cavalry maneuver, and then the auxiliary infantry are deployed to try and rescue the archers who are coming under great stress by the Germans. And you would think, well, what are the Romans doing? Are they having a packed lunch?
But it's worth mentioning here that yes, there's the one on the one hand you have this issue with the narrative and the historical sources, the written sources. The archaeology sometimes is the other way around. In some cases, it's somewhat balanced. The Adam Clusy monument, the monument for the Dacian War, mentions both the victims in the soldiers who died from the legions and auxiliary soldiers. The diplomas we've just mentioned are a unique source, and there happen to be like a handful of diplomas that mention legionary soldiers because there's a special case where soldiers have to be made citizens before they can join the legion. But we have hundreds of those, and they're all for fleet, auxiliary, and Praetorian guardsmen. when it comes to inscriptions for deceased soldiers, it seems like auxiliaries set them up just as much as legionaries, and I wouldn't know the numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are more auxiliary cavalry soldiers whose monuments survive, just because cavalry soldiers got paid better, because they had a horse to maintain. So we have. And of course, from Vindolanda, we have the Vindolanda tablets, which give a unique insight into the daily life and the social strata of an auxiliary unit, and that's just coincidence. But so in the big stories, we have the legions, and a lot of the little sources and structure and all that nitty gritty. We suddenly get a lot of information about auxiliary units.
I think it's also one of the problems with ancient battle narratives is that you get units disappearing all the time. You know, the cavalry at Marathon, the cavalry at Leuctra, lots of battles where a unit appears and then disappears from the narrative. Is that because it didn't play an important part in the battle narrative, or is that because it wasn't what the artist, the source focused on, or the author wanted to focus on? I think there's all sorts of
the commander didn't happen to be family member of the source, or
the telling of a good story. For example, don't let the details get into the telling of a good story. So, for example, in Livy we have the perioeci, right, which is just these little basically snippets of stories. And for example, Livy Perioeci 141 makes mention of Avectius and Chumpstinctus, which are wonderful names, who come from the Belgic tribe of the Nervii. Right. What's very interesting, if you go to the index I put, of the 6 cohortes nerviorum, 4 of them became cives Romanorum. So there's something, presumably, that this, and that's unique. There's no other cohorts that scored that many CR acclamations. That there's something that was in the story that Livy thought was wonderful enough that when the people writing the summary, clearly that was a big storyline, and we have no idea. These 2 names survive. Right. That's it.
I think there's also the way of a good story, and yet what we get in a lot of the battle arrays from Herodotus on are these incredibly intricate. Next to them stood the such and suches, and next to them were 375 of those people, and next to them was 262 of those people. And the things came forward, and the middle got smashed, and we won. You're like, whoa, hang on a minute. Where did all the intricacy of the format? It's almost like they're delaying the drama by getting this huge, which from a
then we're left wondering, is there a difference in how all these peoples fight? Is it just they look slightly different, or these guys happen to have big spears and those are just javelins, or are they all mixed, and it was just interesting to mention all those different people?
Well, I think they do. So for example, the Celtiberian warriors fight with these really small domed shields. They've got the whole panoply of equipment that's different, and presumably that's because they fight mountain warfare. Their cavalry are also very famous because they sort of do circling motions and do all sorts of technically advanced maneuvers which impress Romans and are ideally suited to their terrain. So presumably, if you are a Roman army planner, if such a thing exists, you would, just in the same way that Julius Severus is taken from Britain to fight the Bar-Kokhba War, because there seems to be an implication in that he had fought some kind of military action in the lowlands or the highlands of Britain, and that was a geography which is somehow similar to the geography of Judea, and you would actually kind of put these people in play to their strengths.
Now, a while back we touched upon command and control. Abraham, one of our patrons, wonders, how is our patrons are interpreters used? I think you mentioned that there was Roman, there were Roman led, although Arminius wasn't Roman, was he? He was a Romanized leader rather than a citizen. So how does command and control of the do we know even how the command and control of the auxiliaries were? Were they led, given their own commanders? How do you...
Well, interesting. So I'm looking at Romans and Aliens by J.P.V.D. Bolsden, which is one of my old books here, but it's filled with wonderful things. And there's a whole section where he talks about interpreters. apparently there's evidence for interpreters. Now the question is, are the interpreters only used when, for example, you're dealing with, case in point, Drusus goes to the west coast of the Netherlands and is trying to talk with the Canonifates or the Frisi, and does anybody here speak Frisian? And then presumably somebody says, I know a guy, and that's it. Operationally, though, what happens? You have to imagine a bit like the British Army and the Gurkhas. Apparently, one of the things that happens there is that the British officer I'm told, obviously native Brits, will make some effort to speak Nepalese because, it's about operational efficiency, right? Latin is the governing language of civil and presumably military affairs in the Roman Empire, so clearly the orders will be given in Latin. But to get things done, presumably you have to resort to some practical things like pidgin.
And yet the administration is done in Latin throughout, because we know from like Egyptian papyri where they would otherwise speak Greek. The military paperwork from Egypt is in Latin, so they must have trained them to use Latin to some degree.
I think the orders at the very least. I think the same in the French Foreign Legion. You learn the French. You learn the French to what you need to do, or else you're in deep trouble. But
well, we've got a great example in terms of Sertorius during his earlier career, when you've got the threat coming across from the Cimbri and the Teutones, and he apparently goes into stealth mode and actually goes amongst the barbarians to gather evidence. It doesn't say exactly how long he does it, but he apparently blends in. You'd assume speaking the language. So as a native Italian, he's gone and made the effort to learn the lingo, get in with the culture. And I mean, if somebody from a relatively aristocratic background like him can actually be doing that, you'd sort of think, well, maybe there's more than just that, who are sort of saying, right, for the good of actually being a good general, I do actually have to pick up a little bit of the foreign languages.
Well, you imagine also with the trade, especially in the north of Italy, where they're trading with language groups beyond the Italian Alps, they would probably know enough to be able to conduct business with those peoples, what their language would be. So I think there's probably a wider knowledge. I think the problem with the sources is Latin and the diplomas is Latin, but I think there was probably a lot more knowledge of other languages than
but there's
the sources.
I'm just thought of a case again from the Vindolanda tablets. There is a Decurion Musculus, I think is his name, and he writes to Curialis, the prefect of the cohort. That's cohort Equitatum, that's based at Vindolanda, and it's written in Latin, but this guy is clearly, they're both Batavians, because he also calls him my king, which he may be sucking up, but it's also very possible that Curialis was actually from Batavian nobility. So it's kind of a very interesting mix of sort of like, they've taken some of their social mores back from ye old country, but they do it in Latin.
Well, we're running low on questions now. I have two rather specific ones. So Cosmo asks, during the campaign of Trajan in Dacia, did the emperor employ a vast variety of auxiliary troops to counter the unknown style of Dacian warriors, and did he rely on them to do the dirty and hard work for the campaign?
Possibly.
Is that the most unsatisfying answer ever?
Well, yeah.
I think it's the good old we don't know, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the Animclici monument clearly shows that auxiliaries served in the Dacian wars and at the front because they died. Tiberius Claudius Maximus is, of course, a Roman, even though he served in a cavalry regiment. I think he was in an auxiliary regiment when he brought Trajan the head of Decabolus. But the narratives for the Dacian Wars are just horrible. I mean, we have some bits from Cassius Dio, but we do not nearly have a complete idea of exactly how that war was fought. We tend to just look at Trajan's column and read it in as a scroll and go, well, apparently this is where this just about happens. And of course, in Trajan's column, the auxiliaries are seen doing a lot of fighting, but it is also very much a piece of propaganda. So the idea that the legionaries are only there to build things and be civilizing, and the auxiliaries are only there to do the dirty work, is perhaps a bit too simplistic. Is that a better answer than we don't know?
Possibly. Slightly more satisfying, isn't it? And Brian asks, did the German bodyguards of the Julio-Claudian dynasty sorry, let me ask that again. Did the German bodyguards of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that were employed come from auxiliaries, or was there an agent going to the border and recruiting them if they weren't? Possibly.
No. I think no. We know the specifically the German bodyguard. I think I think it's mentioned. Yes, I think it's mentioned for Caligula when he comes to these regions to probably. I mean, it's mocked, but probably actually make real preparations for the campaign to conquer Britannia. That he also goes here to pick up new recruits for the Corpus Custodes. They are replaced under the Flavians by the cavalry guard, and the cavalry guard is taken from, I think they're selected from the provincial governor guards, which are selected from the cavalry regiments in that province. I think that's the case, but it's been a while since I looked at that, but I think that's how it works.
So there you go. It's a much better answer than possibly.
Writing for Caesar Spidal is the book you want there.
By the way, talking about Caesar, I just wanted to cover the point about interpreters. Everybody knows that Romans thought that anybody speaking other than Greek was a barbarian, because if you didn't speak Greek or Latin, you were a barbarian. He talks about here in the Bulletin book about Decimus learned to speak Celtic, presumably when serving under Caesar in the conquest of Gaul, and he must have spoken it reasonably well, since he hoped when things grew too hot for him in northern Italy in 43 BC to make his way over the Alps to join Brutus and Cassius disguised as a Gaul. And there are some other examples there. There's a Quintus Terentius Cullio, apparently, who was a Carthaginian prisoner in the Second Punic War, who was actually famous because, in fact, he was able to translate documents for the benefit of the Roman Senate. So, so there were people doing interpretations and translations.
Yeah, well, I mean, Hannibal presumably spoke Greek when he went and worked, in Minor. So, mind you, the only way you need to, disguise yourself as a Gaul is put on pants, so you'll be fine.
Well, it's interesting. In the narrative story that Tacitus gives of the night before the Battle of Idis Diviso, there's this interesting cameo when apparently he dons this animal skin and he's able to wander around and listen in. It's something almost like Shakespeare takes on Harry the King Henry IV. It's this sort of animal skin makes him an auxiliary or a camp handler or something, but he can pass unnoticed.
And this is how we know that the way dramatic warriors are depicted in Gladiator is actually realistic.
Of course, of course.
So with that. So with that, as we start to wander, shall we leave it there?
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea.
We're between issues of the magazine next time, so I'll have to dip into the post bag for a topic. Don't forget, if you enjoy the Ancient Warfare chatter, why not become a patron of the podcast? For more details, go to patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. $1 or $2 each month from you helps us to cover the costs of the show, and if there are any shekels spare, perhaps buy us a coffee. We do give patrons exclusive access to watch us record live, and they can fire questions at us as we go along. So that's patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast for how to sign up. So it's a thank you to Jasper, Lindsay, Marc, Mary and Marc. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.